So a table in core data would be equivalent to an entity, or rather entity description with the name recipe and three attributes, name, description, and ingredients. So to further expand upon the core data terminology, let's look at the traditional way data is being stored in iOS apps. It's being stored usually using a SQLite database. So here you have a database and you have a table in there called recipe with 3 columns, name, description, and ingredient. Well, in core data, the SQLite database would be referred to as a persistent object store. The reason they have given this a name, persistent object store, is because you can have different types of object stores. For example, an XML file, a binary file, or you could just be in memory. So SQLite is just one of the options. Next, we have something called entity description. Basically, entity description provides the metadata for a particular entity, in this case, the recipe entity. It tells you about the different types of attributes that are associated to that entity and if there are any relations. For example, the recipe entity could be related to a category entity with a many-to-one relationship so that you could categorize your recipes. The other thing that the entity describes is the class within your application that the entity is associated with. By default, this is an NSManage object, but it could also be a subclass of it if you want to do some complicated calculations when you are creating an entity or reading an entity. Finally, we have our manage object. A manage object essentially represents a single entity. For example, in our recipe entity, we want to retrieve the recipe for pesto. Then that single instance of the pesto recipe would be retrieved as a managed object. Managed objects are instances of NSManaged object or a subclass of it. The NSManaged object acts as a dictionary wherein it supports key-value coding. So now we know some of the basic terminology. Let's go ahead and find out how does the core data framework allow you to access the persistent store, or in this case, the external SQLite database. Firstly, we have something called the persistent store coordinator, which mediates between the objects in your application and the external data stores, in this instance, the SQLite database. Next, we have the managed object context, a scratchpad, as noted in Apple's documentation, which maintains all the managed objects and their relationships. Now, the reason they mention that it's a scratchpad is because you can modify your objects as you like, and the context maintains an undo-redo history stack. It tracks changes to the objects and doesn't write it to the store unless you ask it to. And once you do write it to the store, it makes sure that the managed object is in a valid state. And finally, of course, you have your own application layer. So basically, you talk to the persistent store using the managed object context, and you manipulate the data using managed objects. So we're going to do a little coding now. Let's start by creating an Xcode project. We're going to create a navigation-based application, and we're going to make sure that we use core data for storage. So as you can see under classes, we have root view controller and the app delegate. And under resources, you have the Xcode data model. By default, Xcode creates an entity called event. We're going to delete this because we don't need this. And we're going to create our own entity called recipe. As you can see under class, there is NSManage object. Later on, we'll learn that you can actually subclass NSManage object and then put your own class name over there. Let's add the other attributes, the first attribute being name. We have 3 different options over here. One is optional, whether the name is required or not. transient, whether you want that attribute to be stored in the database, in our case the SQLite database, and last but not least, if you want it to be indexed, whether you want to run search queries against this attribute later on. In our case we do, so we're going to check that off, and we're going to set the type to string. You can add validation over here too, such as min and max length, regular expression, and set a default value. Let's go ahead and create the other attributes. Description. We'll set the type to string. And ingredients. So here we are with our recipe entity and the 3 attributes ready to go. So let's go ahead and create a new controller to actually insert a new recipe. If you look at root view controller, it's a UI table view controller, so that won't really do, because we don't want to display the list of recipes right now. We just want to create a new one. So what we'll do is we'll create a new controller. It's a UI view controller, and we're going to use a nib, and let's call it add recipe controller. So as you can see, it generated the controller files and the nib file. So let's open the nib file in Interface Builder. I'm going to quickly add the 3 text fields for the 3 attributes, the name, description, and ingredients. So this is what your finished view should look like. So why don't we dive into the code? If you look at the interface here, I've declared the 2 text fields, the text view and the UI label for status. I also have defined all the IB outlets, and we have a method called dismiss keyboard. Looking at the implementation, here we synthesize all the IB outlets, and in the dialog we make sure that we have released each one of them. In the dismiss keyboard method, we resign the first responder from each field because we don't know when the user is going to hit the save button. Inside the view.did_load, we set the title, and we set the right bar button item to a system bar button item save, and then we choose an action selector called save recipe. So why don't I create a breakpoint at save recipe and go back to our simulator. Let me fill something out here. And I'll hit the save button. So let's go into what's going on in the save recipe. Basically, I'm getting a reference to the recipe app delegate. Next, I get reference to the manage object context from the delegate. And now we're going to create a new manage object. So here you see we start with the entity description, where we define the name being recipe, and we provided the manage object context. After that, you set, since manage objects use key value coding, you set the value, which is coming from the text fields, and you set the attribute name, which is name, and so on and so forth. You go for description and ingredients in the same manner. And finally, you create an NSError object, and you pass it to the manage object context when you save. So I'm going to do this and go back to the simulator, and there it says recipe saved. So with just a few lines of code, we actually saved all this information into our SQLite database.